everywhere. And the important thing here was that the value of public open space for the first time was beginning to be debated. We had horticulturists in our town councils that were putting in parks, but they were not really, they were just the normal standard old green and a few trees and a couple of swings, nothing meaningful. But the value of open space was debated at nationally, and the function and meaning and the relevance of it was also being debated. And it's during this time that the design then of public space and the landscapes associated with them began to start being commissioned by our government. And what this meant was that we could begin to start looking at projects that were beginning to be socially and environmentally responsive, and that they were also trying to mimic the government's notion or idea of moving forward in terms of the African identity and a common ground that would be shared by all South Africans, because prior to that, as we know, in the apartheid era, everything was segregated. So these new places would be seen to carry commemorative, memorial, and cultural and recreation and expression, and a fantastic opportunity for landscape architects. So this change was driven by an understanding then that landscape architecture is defined not only as the formation of private gardens, but also of public places that have an intimate relationship with nature. That landscapes bear witness to the cultures that shape them, and we needed to understand culturally relevant ways of dealing with these public environments. That all living things are interdependent, and the landscape is where they all come together. Concept which we all are familiar with, but perhaps some people in the past were not so understanding of that. That the very lifeblood of our profession is the nature of the changing landscape. You know, our profession is fantastic in that we put something in the ground and it's always changing. It's never static. And that the landscape itself belongs broadly to a constant state of flux, as we know, life, birth, death, and so on. And so, of course, there's our profession. And in the last 20 years, the first 20 years after 1994, change was more rapid than any periods before. And the profession had begun to start re-emerging and was being recognized for its critical role in the design and development of meaningful public spaces. So during this time, when I unpacked it and sort of had a look at this, there were two main shifts and perhaps 5 trends that I could understand were beginning to happen since 94. The first one is an economic shift, and that is that we were now had to understand that there was not an abundance of funds and there was a scarcity of resources. And so contemporary landscape architecture had to begin to start focusing on the strategic resource allocation, or the reuse or reimagining of external systems, externalities. So for instance, one system's what we might want to throw away becomes another system's commodity. And for instance, we see this in open space now when we look at it not only as a place for recreation and habitat creation, but also stormwater management, etc. So we're beginning to economically understand the value of landscape approach to dealing with urban and rural issues. And kinds of projects that evolved over time were projects like this. This is an upgrade of a street system in the northern part of Pretoria. And these squares here were basically brownfield, derelict land, which were beginning to be turned into public squares with retail and services around them. And the road itself was being upgraded with bus transportation systems. Heritage sites like the synagogue here, which related also to the apartheid era struggle, were beginning to be designed, squares were beginning to be designed around them, etc. So they're looking at repurposing of derelict land became one of these main shifts in what we were looking at. The second one is the idea of ecology. Of primary interest to us as designers was how we were to create these frameworks for change in our cities, which needed to change, and our attitude towards how we dealt with environmental issues and design projects in our urban environments. So we were looking for ecologically influenced models that looked to culturally relevant and nature-driven solutions. And these we began to understand these were the practical approaches that we needed to address the challenges that we found in our urban environment. And with biodiversity loss and climate change were all beginning to become buzzwords now, which we were beginning to have to attend to. And typically then where we started moving to was sort of an ecological approach to understanding projects. This is buildings and landscape integrating together, becoming one, and understanding climatic issues, and understanding that landscapes need to regenerate themselves. So the areas around these buildings, this is in a rural situation, would needed to be designed in a certain way that they integrated with the landscape itself. And then, projects like this might evolve where you've got a rather fantastical image of what an inspiration and vision for what an ecological approach could bring to, in this case, it was a biodiversity center. So with the ecological and economic paradigm shifts, 5 trends began to take root in this period. This is this period from 94 all the way through to today. And those trends are, the first one I've titled acceptance, and that occurred in our township areas where parks initially were rejected because people didn't want them. They saw them as places that were dangerous. They were looking to houses which had been promised by the government. So there was a major trend in dealing with township parks and the development of them. Then there was this emergence of the African Renaissance, as Thabo Mbeki, the president of the time, put forward. How do we redesign our public spaces so that they emerge and that they become African in feel and sense and identity, and people living in this country who before were not able to partake could feel and identify with these public spaces. And they became... Here we see public buildings, legislative buildings and new buildings that were being built by the government soon after 2000 that begin to reflect this attitude. And then leading with landscape, where we look at large scale and scaling up projects and visionary projects in our urban and inner cities which needed so much work and which have deteriorated to a large degree. So leading with landscape was how do we approach dealing with urban design and urban planning, but taking landscape as the leading role. And then, of course, there was the idea of memorials or reconciliation. How do we reconcile what has happened in the past and let us remember about what had happened in the past and never forget? So there was a push for memorials in South Africa. And then finally, the last trend that I've sort of unpacked was the idea of urban values, how we reevaluate our urban environments and where the visions for these environments are so important, because we as designers are visionaries. And without these visions, of course, nothing can happen. So I'll take you through these a number of projects then in each of these 5 trends. This is Moroka Park Precinct Park in Soweto, and here I'm giving a talk to the locals. The guy that had the keys for the hall where we were supposed to meet didn't show up, so we had to meet outside and we put the plans up on the wall. And we're explaining and bringing the community on board with what they saw for happening in their community and what this park should become. And this particular park was the first park to be developed in Soweto, major park to be developed in Soweto after 94. It was developed in around 1990 to 2002. And there was a lot of focus on getting the community involved in this project because, as I said, there was a lot of pushback by the community members for parks. When the government had said, look, we will give you houses, they said parks are places that are unsafe. We don't want them. We want houses. But we managed to push this through, and we got the community involved, and they came, and we developed a vision for this series of parks together. It's a lot of detail. I won't go into it here. Suffice just to show you some of the photographs. But the focus of this particular park was taking a dam which had silted up and desilting it and creating a system of stormwater attenuation and an amenity which became the central focus of the park. Here you can see it. There were places on the periphery of the park which were made like this little sporting event there. And what you see here are mosaics that were developed by children in the local school nearby creche, where they were asked to draw portraits of themselves, and then women that we had taught through this project in the form and the art of mosaic then created these mosaics, and they put them on this little stage area. And so that was another way of people taking ownership of the park. In a dry, dusty environment, green lawns and trees and shade become very important, and this was one of the features of the park. This is a memorial outside one of a church which was very important during the apartheid era as a place that harbored people that were against the government. And so this little water feature stroke memorial was put there. Here you can see the women that are being trained in the art of mosaic, developing and building the mosaics. And then also in some instances, the women that had been trained would come up with designs for mosaics. In this case, it was a slogan that they took from the anti-apartheid movement, which says in English, but it was from their language. They said, "You strike the woman, you strike the rock." It was a slogan, and they took that to the apartheid government basically as a women's movement to dismantle apartheid. And so the political movings of people in the area were now beginning to being placed into the park. Another important project was the one in Harare Square in Cape Town, and this was done under the auspices of the Violence Prevention Through Urban Upgrades project, which takes township environments like this in the Cape, which are windswept. These are all the open spaces which are contested places, derelict places, where places where crime was happening. And the landscape architects in the city of Cape Town envisaged this network of parks, which were eventually built and then managed and maintained, as you can see here, by some of the people in the community. And this was a fantastic project. And the statistics, the research they did post this project showed that the crime in and around these areas dropped quite dramatically. Not only was there now nighttime lighting, but it was designed, if you go back to this slide here, each of these sort of turns in the network of open space, buildings were located like this one here, that then had view lines down both of these avenues or open spaces, and so they became a surveillance system as well. And then also during this period, children from the neighborhoods were asked to make little ideas for what the play areas could be like, and then the landscape architects designed these into a model, showed the children, got buy-in, and then they actually developed and built these play areas. This one was installed at a sort of a shopping center stroke service center in Khayelitsha. And then even in the schools, and this project here is a school in this windswept township area where it becomes a haven for education and a safe keeping of children, and very much what would you call it? An oasis in this particular environment. This particular project by Tana Klitzner won the Rosa Barber Award recently for small projects. And it's just was how the interplay between the building and the spaces worked so well, and then the introduction of indigenous plant materials. The second trend is the one called emergence. And what I'm talking about here is in the early days, the government was very clear it wanted to have projects that sort of expressed Africanism. So here we have the Riverside Government Complex, which is an office building that was built to house government agencies, which were all over the province, were now going to be consolidated and centralized. And what was important here was also because this was in the early 2000s when this project came about. And here's a critique saying that something needs to be said about the way in which the work of the other disciplines, you see, because Amir was talking about landscape architecture not being understood perhaps in parts of the world. And the same thing happened here, although we've got a relatively big history, long history rather. And he was talking to architecture and engineering being the recognized. But in this case, he was saying the landscaping and the interior architects, we needed to be commended because, and then he goes on to say that the landscaping and artwork are submerged into the fabric of the complex as is seldom seen in South Africa, seamlessly integrating rather than applied. Which brings me back to this notion of visibility and invisibility. Sometimes our best projects are invisible. People do not quite know and understand that a landscape architect's design has been there. And if that's the case and they feel comfortable there and safe there, then I say our job has been done well. But this project was a major project. It won all sorts of awards for architecture and landscape architecture. This is the legislature building, which is picking up on the granite domes in the area, but also on the granaries that a lot of the local cultures use to store grain. And so it was the form that was given to these buildings came from that African reference. And here we have a water feature which refers to the African bowl used for all sorts of various things, or also in this area which was known for gold, panning for gold. So that became a central feature in the plaza, which was the public plaza associated with the legislature building. And this is the edging to that plaza, giving a lot of shade, because in this part of the world, it gets extremely hot in the summer months. And then here you can see where the building and the landscape, again, that I just read that quote from, begin to emerge with each other. We used only endemic species to the area, and the building and the landscape sort of become one in many ways. This is a little sunken garden at the entrance to the legislature, which picks up on the granites from the area and the fact that the building is adjacent to a major river system. Then we look to leading with landscape, the third of these trends that I talked about. And here we're looking at expanding scales and how landscape architecture then began to start getting involved at the urban scale. In this case, it revolves around an area which was to be redeveloped, or a framework was required for it. But we suggested that the focus of the framework start with this water feature and the streams that fed it, which currently are just engineered streams. And using the notion of landscape urbanism that drove this whole process, we began to illustrate how an urban design plan can evolve from this idea of leading, the landscape being the first piece in the jigsaw puzzle, if you like. And so we took these arms that came into the water, the feature itself, the big pan, and then out into the river again. And what was used to be a concrete canal was suggested to be opened up into a more natural environment. And you can see ideas of what we were suggesting these places would become. And then by doing that, we would expand the open space footprint quite dramatically. We were also looking at reclaiming mine dumps associated with the area. And then the green space surrounding the dam becomes a very important part of this jigsaw puzzle. And of course, if you're dealing with urban design, public transportation was important. So the idea of TOD, or the BRT systems, became in a layer that was overlaid onto this whole system. And then infill housing was proposed along with sports facilities. And then ultimately you have a framework where you put it all together. But you've led this whole process with landscape architecture. The other project I want to just talk about is a project that was driven by the mayor of Johannesburg, who wanted in his words, a central park in the center of the city. But it's a very dense city. And we entered the competition and were fortunate to win the competition. Unfortunately, this is not happening, but at least it's still there. But the idea here was to take existing situations and build up on them. And this diagram here basically says this was what was in place. And what we needed to do was create an open space system that linked all of these existing urban and natural features and cultural features together to create a framework, and then overlay onto that a transit-orientated development system with public transportation linking all of these things. And then this becomes the seam that runs across the center of the city. And here you can see the center of the inner city of Johannesburg. One of the main features, which is quite unusual, is that we have a shunting yard, which is this brown for railway lines, right in the middle of the city. You know, most cities they're on a water feature or a river running through it. We had a train system running through it. And the idea then was to take the building blocks which are in place. And of those building blocks then, in this case, where the blue is the existing public transportation network, we were then looking to build on that and understand the green network that's happening on the top here, which is an existing ridgeline system, and how that can be part of the system of pulling it all together, existing parks that needed to be upgraded. And then we start with the real work, where we're focusing on the central area, which we want to completely take the shunting yards away, keep the main line through for the railway lines. But because it was sunken in many areas, we could bridge over it, because it was also a major schism of the inner city. And we started looking at how we could create park spaces along its edges and also over top of the railway line. And here you can see what that looks like in the center of the city. It was a major obstacle that we had to overcome. And then we started looking at the very early stages, because this couldn't all happen at once, where we would use a bridging system of pedestrian ways and plazas. And if you sort of toggle between these two, you can see where they would happen in the bottom diagram across the railway lines. And then ultimately the park would be developed. This park would be developed along ecological lines, biodiversity, stormwater, all of those kinds of things that we know. And it would then become the big deal also from an economic point of view, as I said, one of those earlier, is that it becomes a catalyst for development. So once we have now a feature in the center of the city that people can relate to, where developers might want to come in and start building buildings, as the case might be here. And these would be multifunctional buildings that would be residential, retail, commercial, whatever service. And so the vision and the scale of thinking of landscape architecture and dealing with inner city issues was something which had never been done before. Then, of course, having come through this very dramatic period of a struggle for freedom, President Nelson Mandela, when he was in Parliament one day in about 1905, I think it was, they were talking about the idea of where do we recognize these people that have come and fought for this nation to be what it is today. And he said, where's this place, this Freedom Park? And he just sort of threw that out. But from that, in Parliament became a whole series of projects that the government called national legacy projects, which they basically looked at memorializing and putting in memory those people who had fought for freedom. And there was then this dialogue with the nation that started to also understand what these places would become. So I'm just going to go through a couple of them. This is the Sharpeville Memorial in a place near, not too far from Johannesburg, where a number of people were killed by the riot police at the time. And here you can see each pole represents the people that were killed. It's in an industrial area where this happened, and the park evolved in that industrial area. And basically it was a very somber place, but very aesthetically and beautifully done, using 3 or 4 materials, that's all. But memorializing the place of those people who had died. And then in smaller situations like this is in the KwaZulu-Natal area of South Africa, which is a memorial to the isiZulu chiefs. And it sits on a hill which overlooks a beautiful valley. And this was designed by an artist and not a landscape architect, but just a beautiful, sensitive touch with cultural elements brought into the memorial, which in the past would not have been the case. And then the seminal project, perhaps, and the one that was Nelson Mandela put a lot of energy into, and subsequently the next president, President Thabo Mbeki, was Freedom Park in Pretoria. And I just want to explain the process here, because basically the client was the whole nation. So we needed to find from the nation what this place should become. So we held focus groups and workshops with all these people that you can see there. We commissioned a whole bunch of research with academics, historians, and indigenous knowledge people. And then all of this information was fed into the design team. But this process that I've just described here took about 2 years before any design happened. There was a massive to try and get from the people what it is that they thought or thought could be how we memorialize a place. A team of architects, landscape architects, and artists were put together, and we had to process this information and then present it to the client, which was called ultimately the Phase 2 Committee, and they had technical advisors on this committee, artists, many people on this committee. And one would think that sometimes when you go through this process, you're going to end up with something that is probably less than desirable. But in fact, it ended up being fantastic. And this iterative process would be bounced around between the design team and the client and his committees, ultimately until a resolution was found and we could then start designing. So that process took about 2 years. The implementation of the park took another 10 years. So it was 12 years of my life working on this project. But this is what it looks like today. It sits on a hill, and again, I can't go through all the detail on it. It's basically a garden within the gardens, and there are many different components to it. The Kapo here, or the museum, the Isivivani here, which was a sacred place, and then on top of the hill, an amphitheater stroke memorial place. So this became then the major project that the government focused on in terms of this notion or idea of memorializing people. And they didn't only use the apartheid period. They went way back in history to understand how all sorts of people had been involved to get the country to where it was, all the way going back to its indigenous people, the Khoisan. And so what you see here on the right-hand side of this is a wall of what they call a wall of names, where all the names of these people that are known were, or if a name, and often the names of people were not known, but maybe just an event. So that would be located on that wall. And then on top of the hill, which was a quarry, we repurposed a quarry here, became the amphitheater area for events to happen, and etc. And then the pathway system that joined the entrance to the park through the museum. You walk up a series of pathways through the Isivivani. I'll get to that in a minute, which is basically a burial place, and then to the an area just before you get into Skumbutu on the top of the hill. So it was this very important project that this is the museum, or what they call it Kapo, which was named for the Khoisan people who Kapo, the term Kapo means a dream is not a dream until it's dreamt by the community. And that came out in one of these sessions we had with the Khoisan people when we were explaining what Freedom Park we wanted it to become. And then this is Isivivani, which is the place, the symbolic burial place of all the people that were involved with freedom, leading up to freedom. And it needed to be designed around universal symbols. And again, there's a whole lecture of an hour and a bit that I could go into this one and how we did that. But what you're seeing here is the central area where boulders from each province were brought to represent each of the provinces. And the mist that's coming up from this here is referring to Pepu, or which is the incense that the indigenous people would burn when they wanted to communicate with their ancestors, because a lot of them believe in ancestor worship. And so but that also could be the idea of water, the idea of cleansing and healing, which the government was suggesting these national monuments should become. They should be places of reconciliation. They were also a place then where people would come and commemorate and just, recognize the people who had passed. And then also where cultural events would take place, like this Ndebele group who are coming to do a ceremony and acknowledge their ancestors. Then you go up the hill, and this is the way I suggested the wall of names, which eventually takes you to the top of the hill, and Sukubutu and the amphitheater area surrounded by these reeds, which have also a whole bunch of symbolic significance, but I can't go into that right now. But this is where that was sort of the epitome of perhaps this notion of memorialization and this dialogue with the nation. And then finally, we're looking at urban values. And this is now where we're beginning to start in subsequent to 1994, and perhaps even probably around 2000 to 2005, where we began to start looking at redeveloping large portions of our urban environments. And we took advantage, for instance, in this case of the World Cup in 2010, the football World Cup, when this area adjacent where the stadium was eventually built and the areas adjacent to it were mostly derelict brownfield sites, were repurposed as parks and had to connect, if you see here, connect back to the center of the city where a lot of things were happening over here. And then one of the major issues was this intersection here where there were just roads everywhere, and the landscape architects and engineers came up with this fantastic idea of lowering the landscape to quite about 4 or 5 meters so that the roads could go over top and the landscape could come through beneath, and then pedestrians from the center inner city could then move through to this park system ultimately, which comes down this main walkway system, which then takes you past the stadium and to the sea beyond. In Johannesburg, the idea here was to start giving identity to public systems and public roads. This is the transitway system, which was designed to brand, I suppose you would say, the routes where public transportation would go on, something which hadn't been done before. And then even to take infrastructure like parking areas outside the train station and turning them into something which is other than just a parking area. And then visions for the future. And this is in the inner city of Pretoria, where this project has been approved by council, but as yet has not been built. And the notion of this project was, again, to take an old stadium that had become derelict, was heritage-wise was quite important in terms of soccer and sports in the inner city, but to turn it into a multifunctional place, which was designed distinctly around ecological and stormwater management systems and biodiversity, all of those things, which words that we hear about today. But the idea was then one of the major issues with this particular park, and we have in South Africa, is water, and how do you maintain and manage these things. So we managed to show that through a system of capturing water on site, stormwater, and accessing water from an aquifer that sat beneath this building on the right here, we were able to take that water to a filtration system underneath what we called the commons, and eventually were able to show that we were able to get enough water to deal with irrigation for the entire year. And this is a diagram which illustrates that central area, the water filtration systems on the side here. Excuse me. This whole network of systems also becomes a place of learning, because there are many schools around it. So people and schools, the idea would be to bring children to these places so that they could learn about the natural processes and how stormwater can be recycled, etc. And then, of course, these places in the urban and the inner city need to be operate at nighttime. And so then, now in conclusion, I just want to leave you with a little story. But to keep in mind that whilst the nation had gone through this emancipation, this period of coming from post-colonialism, apartheid, to post-colonialism, to a new nation, to a nation where they sought their own identity, where they were emancipated from the horrors of apartheid and colonialism. And where prior to these times, prior to 94, many people living in our part of the world were invisible. They were not visible. They were not concerned as equal citizens in their own country. In a way, the same thing can be said about our landscape architecture, where it was there. It was operating since, as you saw, from the 1960s all the way to 1994, but not really in a meaningful way. And most of the projects were sponsored by rich people and monies that came from the private sector. The public realm was neglected. So during that same period, paralleling what was happening to the country, arguably was happening to our profession. So I'm going to leave you with a story, which is a poetic story about the invisible becoming visible. And it was quoted at the opening of Freedom Park by President Thabo Mbeki, who was our president at the time. And it quotes Ben Okri, a Nigerian British poet, from his book Astonishing the Gods. And the story you'll see when I quote from it is about how, and what Okri was writing about was the people pre-colonial, pre-colonial times, the people in Africa who basically were invisible to the suppressors. So here is what he had to say. He says, he was born invisible. His mother was invisible too, and that was why she could see him. It was in books that he first learnt of his invisibility. He searched for himself and his people in all the history books and read and discovered to his youthful astonishment that he didn't exist. He traveled the seas, saying little, and when anyone asked him why he journeyed and what his destination was, he always gave two answers. One answer was for the ear of the questioner, and the other answer was for his own heart. The first went like this: I don't know why I am traveling. I don't know where I am going. And the second answer went like this: I'm traveling to know why I am invisible. My quest is for the secret of visibility. For those who worked with him in those years saw him as a simple man. Actually, they didn't see him at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham. Very inspiring, educational, and gives us a little bit of hope for overcoming challenges and struggles of nations. Thank you so much.